Welcome back. This is the second installation of the draft EIS construction, and today we're going to talk about comments and responses. So how many days does the public have to respond to a draft EIS? Who can remind me? That's right, 90 days. So during that 90 days, you're going to get all kinds of different comments, and you're going to have to respond formally as an agency. So we're going to look at that process. So as with everything with NEPA, you want an efficient and well-documented approach, and you want to have high-quality responses. And that's challenging because a lot of times you get high emotion comments that sometimes take on a personal nature, and you have to try to be the mediating or moderating force and give a professional response. So you can get all kinds of different comments. They can be written down, they could be verbal, they could be electronic, could come from anywhere in the world. Could be form letters where you just get thousands upon thousands of the same letter with different names on it, or you could get formal petitions from an organization. Then what? Then what do you do with them? So you want to approach this kind of like scoping comments, right? You want to categorize them. Because in the final EIS, you're responsible for having summarized them and responded to them. You want to make sure for the administrative record that you have every original piece of correspondence. So if it's written, you have to keep that. You want to look for salient or discrete issues. You're trying to extract those from each piece of correspondence you get. And you want to look at them independently, but oftentimes you want to start thinking about how you can group them into similar categories. So you want to think about maybe affiliations, their locations. There's lots of different ways you can categorize comments. You want to have a systematic nomenclature for it, the comment number, a letter number. You want to start with broader topics, right, that can capture a large number if you've got a large number of responses. Could be on a specific topic within the EIS, so maybe you categorize it by sage-grouse issues. You may categorize, and you want to be thinking about which staff and your interdisciplinary team is going to be responsible for responding. And then you also want to call out like red flag issues, right, that is going to be elevated above staff level to policy or legal, or maybe the executive level. So you want to be thoughtful in how you categorize and organize your comments. Like I said, you want to have a specific format. You want to flag them as they're received. You don't want to think about the source. You want to give every single one independently weight. So it's not like you might think of a quantitative analysis. You may have 3,000 comments on sage grouse and grazing and wildland fire, but just because you have 3,000 of them doesn't mean you couldn't get one comment on special status plants that is substantive enough to be considered equal with those thousands of others. So you're not necessarily counting, but you do want to categorize and lump them. Usually you want to have somewhat of an experienced team going through this and kind of looking for nuance. You want to lump where possible and split where needed. So this is an example from an actual draft EIS in the Forest Service, and oftentimes if it's a heated issue, you'll see a lot of them have this kind of a tone to them. You'll see, is this a joke? They'll tell you a lot about how you need to do your job. In this draft EIS, you don't even try to fake compliance with the NEPA. And then you can see he starts getting into more substantive topics, and you can see on the right there, they've got it categorized or coded, right? So this will be comment 1.1, and then you'll see a specific response to that by the agency. So you don't necessarily have to take into account opinion or unsupportable claims, right? So you don't even need to categorize that, but you do want to pull out important information over here on this side. So this is an example of what any standard, simple database will look like. You can see on the left, we've got organized by a comment number. This is actually from a project I'm working on. What the original comment was, or the text that it's referring to, the actual comment, the agency that should be designated to work on it, and then there's a responsibility. Who does it need to go to? Which division? And then has it internally? What's the status? Is it pending? Is it being worked on, or is it done? And then you can talk about your specific response. Now, when you go to give this back to the general public and stakeholders, you don't necessarily have to have all this information, but you want to make sure that you categorize them like this so you can track it very well. You probably will only give them the agency response in association with their comment. They don't need to know who handled it, all that information. So within your interdisciplinary team, you're going to have an actual response team. You can designate somebody, or you may get picked to be that person. It's a tough job. And then you have to figure out who's going to sort them, who's going to decide on the approach, the categories, who's going to designate which ones need to go to experts or legal staff. And this is an important point, that second bullet. You don't have to wait until the close of the comment period before you start organizing and responding. You can be doing that during that 90 days, and that'll help you keep a pace and not sacrifice schedule. You need to decide if there's something that's going to have a big impact on the document and what changes are going to be needed, and you have to reflect that in the document. And again, you have to be professional, even though a lot of times they're calling you out pretty strongly. So what do you do with it? There's lots of different actions you can do when you receive comments. You could modify what you're proposing to do. You could create a new alternative or evaluating alternatives in ways that hadn't previously been taken seriously. So you can say, yeah, that might be an interesting way to look at it. Let's use this model and analyze it this way. You may build on what you've already done. If there's just blatant factual errors, then you can correct those. And some of them you won't respond to, and so you might just say comment acknowledged, or you might explain why the comments do not warrant further consideration. Maybe it's out of scope, or not substantive, or it's an opinion-based fact or something like that. So here's an example. This is back to the one we were looking at. So you remember the tone, right? Basically saying that you're idiots, it's not going to comply with NEPA, but the Forest Service was very careful to provide concise, clear, and professional responses. So in that first one, he said, 7 alternatives, including 6 action alternatives and a no action, were considered. The reasons for not giving all the action alternatives detailed analysis is described on the draft EIS so-and-so. So it's concise, it's to the point, and make sure that you have some level of resolution for every comment. So when could you get a comment that's strong enough to where you have to do the entire draft EIS over again, right? And you might call that a supplemental draft EIS because you're completely replacing it. So one reason is you might get some very significant new information, right? So it may change all of your conclusions and your analysis. You might have new impacts that weren't adequately analyzed in the draft, and they actually are significant and maybe were being called not. They might have new alternatives that you'd have to redo the whole document, or at least the analysis, because you have to compare that alternative, that new one, with every other alternative, including the no action. Or if there's just in general new circumstances within the region or within the agencies that are significant enough to cause you to change directions or need to redo alternatives to be considered or analysis. So here's another example. The comment was mandatory regulations versus voluntary guidelines. Several commenters supported the adoption of mandatory regulations, while others stated that voluntary guidelines are adequate to protect the whales. So you can see that this wasn't a verbatim comment. This is a summary of a group of comments. And then you can see that the National Marine Fisheries Service provided a pretty detailed explanation. Here's another one. The Wyoming Department of Ag urges the BLM to consult, cooperate, and coordinate with livestock grazing permittees in the project area to ensure impacts to their grazing operations are reduced and mitigated. Response: BLM will continue to consult, cooperate, coordinate with the operators and grazing permittees in the project area. So they'll basically say that they will continue to do that. Another one regarding a letdown fence, sage grouse. And you can see it's a pretty thoughtful, long response. This one is all about auditory or noise level impacts. And you can see the response was basically that the specific measures have not been identified that would warrant that analysis. Okay, so that concludes for today. Hopefully you can have a somewhat general understanding of how the public and stakeholders will comment on a draft EIS, and then how you as an agency or a third-party contractor or a cooperating agency can organize, sort, and summarize those responses. Your third project is specific to this, and we'll send out instructions and directions on that. If you have any questions, please reach out. Have a good day.